Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined by my co-host Scott Karasik. Today we are back following up on the Falcons 2016 season. We're going to talk about the coaching changes and sort of the reshuffling that's gone on in the coaching staff since the end of their year. We will talk about the offensive skill positions in our roster review, talk a little bit about, free agents, who we think we should sign, what positions are needs and whatnot. And we'll answer your guys' mailbag questions at the end of the show and throughout the other portions of the show as well. So, Scott, let's talk about these coaching changes. It may seem like there's probably a couple of moves still yet to be made, but for the most part, that seems like it's going to be a couple of like offensive quality control guys or some defensive assistants as opposed. They got pretty much all the major positions filled, right? Am I mistaken in that?
I mean, I think it's like quarterback coach, receiver. Well, no, not receivers coach. Quarterbacks coach. They might or might not have a new defensive pass game coordinator. Not 100% sure.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we talked a little bit about this move last week, so we won't go into it, but we talked about the Steve Sarkisian hire for offensive coordinator. We found out this past week that Marquand Manuel will take over as the defensive coordinator, replacing Richard Smith. The Falcons have also hired their quarterback coach in Bush Hamdan. Bryant Young is their defensive line coach. They hired Jess Simpson to be their assistant D-line coach. They also adjusted a couple of titles. Keith Carter was the assistant offensive line coach. He'll now be coaching the running backs. Raheem Morris is going to stick at the wide receivers coach, but he added passing game coordinator to his resume, presumably offensive, because it sounds like Jerome Henderson is going to stick around as a defensive passing game coordinator because he didn't get the defensive coordinator job in San Francisco. Doug Mallory was one of the defensive assistants. He'll take over for Manuel at the DB's coach. And they had this pretty much a mass exodus of pretty much every offensive assistant coach. A couple of guys went with Kyle Shanahan in San Francisco. A couple of guys got fired, like Richard Smith and Brian Cox. Matt LaFleur, the quarterback coach, I think is now with the Rams. I always get the LaFleur brothers mixed up. Chad Walker was a defensive assistant. He went to some college or something to be like the D coordinator there or something like that. So a lot of shuffling. We got a couple of mailbag questions pertaining to some of these changes, and we'll answer those. First up, we have Charlie Rogers 68. He asks, what are your thoughts on Manuel becoming the defensive coordinator? I bet he will help elevate our D to heights we haven't seen since #GritSplits.
I'm not sure he's going to bring them that good. Like, I don't think Manuel makes that much of a difference. It's still going to be Quinn's defense. Quinn is running the show there, and he wants to make sure that the defense fits what he wants it to do. Now,
I sort of thought the defensive coordinator stuff was a little bit overblown because I think at the end of the day, it's Dan Quinn's defense. Like, if Manuel does a great job, then great, wonderful, that's awesome. But if he doesn't, then Dan Quinn's going to take over like he did this past season and sort of, take care of that. So it's always going to basically be Dan Quinn is either the outright defensive coordinator that's making all the decisions, or he's just going to be the guy lurking in the shadows that's looking over Marquand Manuel's shoulder as he makes the decisions and just sort of like saying, don't do that. Yeah, do that, So, yeah. I think Marquand Manuel, he's an up-and-coming coach. I think this is about time. He got an interview with the Jags last year for their D coordinator spot. So, if they didn't promote him this year, there was a pretty good chance that next year he could have potentially walked to some other team to be their D coordinator. So I think this is a smart move by the Falcons.
I agree.
Broken Falcons fan at William Ash 227 asks, what makes a good position coach in your eyes?
I would say the ability to teach the position, to teach the role, to teach what you're supposed to do in the scheme. So a guy like Bryant Young. His job is to make sure that the defensive linemen understand their technique, can improve on the technique, and understand their role within the scheme to run these different stunts and how to run these stunts. Bryant Young has coached under Dan Quinn before. Bryant Young has also played under Dan Quinn before as one of his players in the scheme, or players when he was a coach. Now, the Falcons did bring in some Davidson, who coached at Buford for fucking ever and did a great job there. But he's basically a high school coach making a jump to the pros as a position coach. So I don't really know what he specialized in. I just know that Buford was a powerhouse every time he was in there, and it's not exactly the best district for talent. So I'd love to see what he can do here. I do think that the best position coaches are the ones that get more out of the group than you expect. Like Ulbrich getting the linebackers to project a little bit further than I guess any of us would have. But we also don't see what a position coach does on a daily basis. So we don't know exactly what works for all of these guys. But I do think that a good position coach understands how to teach the nuances of his position and make those players better.
Yeah. I think you're right, Scott, with what makes a good position coach. I think the issue is, as you said, we don't really, pretty much 90% of what a position coach does, we don't really ever get to see it. We sort of see the result of it, but it's not always sort of cut and dry of, oh, well, this player is not performing at a level that we want them to, so therefore his position coach is bad, because every player learns differently, every player develops differently, and so it's sort of hard to sort of put a blanket on a position coach over whether or not he's doing his job adequately, just basically going off of the on-field results. So it's from my perspective, I think position coaches are certainly important, but I think people spend a little bit too much time thinking about position coaches when they don't. You're just never, unless you're within the organization or you actually play on the team, you're just never going to see what they do. So, wasting time and energy thinking about what this position coach is doing versus what this other position coach is doing, I think it's just sort of just a waste of energy.
I will say it's kind of obvious how when the linebackers in the secondary do take strong leaps quickly, you can be like, oh, that guy is doing a good job.
Yeah, fair enough.
Players are doing bad. You're just like, well, was it bad or what happened? Like with Ulbrich, you could see Deion Jones' technique improved throughout the year. Campbell's technique improved throughout the year. They learned where they were fucking up within the scheme, and it helped out. With the secondary, with Manuel, you could see they just got better. Like all of them got better throughout the year as it went on. Alford got better. Collins tremendously got better from where he was last year. He's still not there. Like he's not there yet, but he's still way better than he was last year. And then Poole just coming in out of nowhere. He did a lot more than what he was doing in college this year in Atlanta. I'm going to tell you that one right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely true that when a position coach is doing his job, it becomes a little bit more obvious that he's doing a good job. It becomes a little less obvious if he's not, because there's so many reasons why a player is not performing up to par that sort of just saying, well, the position coach is not coaching him is just sort of a little bit too much of an assumption, is basically what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
So it works for some players. It doesn't work for everybody, That's part of the hard part of teaching, which is not everybody learns the same way. And so you could be a great position coach that teaches a certain way and it works for, a third of the guys that you coach, but then there's another third of those that's not the ideal way to teach them, and it just doesn't get through to them. So, that's, I guess, so another thing that you look for in a position coach is sort of that flexibility to not just teach it one way, to be able to teach it multiple ways.
Yeah. Now, I will say that one change that I'd like to see on the staff, I'd like to see him promote Schulters to a defensive backs coach, because Mallory mainly works with corners. That's like what he's done his entire career. and Manuel was a safety and worked primarily with the safeties. And I think if there was a guy that you could come in and be like, hey, you're a safety, you're a former safety who's played both spots and understands the nuances within the scheme, it'd be a guy like Lance Schulters, because he's played free and strong in the NFL at a Pro Bowl level. So bringing him in as a defensive backs coach after working with the team last year as a special teams intern doesn't seem like a bad way to go. Especially since you're going to be like, hey, this is your bread and butter. This is what you played. You know how to be good in the league. You understand technique. You could put him and Manuel back there as a way to coach the coach as well. And then you just have to find an assistant linebackers coach on defense, an assistant offensive line coach on offense, and then just a couple more random assistants on offense.
Yep. Swaggy PhD at Rush Kardashian asks, will having a new coaching staff mitigate or exacerbate the Super Bowl hangover?
I think it's going to mitigate it, but I also don't think that there was going to be a Super Bowl hangover. Because when you look at all those Super Bowl teams that were hungover, or even those teams that make it to like the NFC Championship game and were hungover, they're super old in key spots and are probably cutting 3 or 4 starters that year for age or contract or whatever. If Atlanta loses starters this year, it's just because it's guys at spots they could upgrade, like strong side end, like 3 technique with John Babineau instead of, why would you want to keep John Babineau when you could have a better 3 technique this year? So and Chris Chester at right guard, he's 34 years old, 35 years old to start the season. You want someone else there. So I think the Falcons are going to look at all that and go, you know what? We're not going to have a hangover. We're going to keep getting better, and we're going to get better on defense.
Yeah, look, I think it's a little early at this time to sort of speculate on what will happen this upcoming season. Who knows? The biggest issue I think the Falcons are going to have to deal with is complacency and injuries. They were pretty, outside of a couple of major injuries, they were pretty much, they didn't really have to deal with injuries to a huge extent this past season, particularly on offense. So we'll have to see what happens. I think the coaching staff changes certainly won't hurt, but I don't necessarily know if there's any one thing that, hiring Brian Young is going to be able to do and be like, oh yeah, it's going to fix this one issue. So, I don't know whether or not the Falcons going to have a Super Bowl hangover. We'll see. So I don't really have an answer for that question. All right, let's talk about the roster. And we're going to do this the next couple of weeks. We're going to talk about the offensive skill positions this week. We'll switch to the trenches next week. And then we'll finish up with the DBs and special teams the week after that. Try to get you guys ready for free agency. That's not that far off. Let's go position by position. And, quarterback situation obviously is pretty solid at the starting spot. But right now, Matt Ryan is technically the only quarterback under contract. Matt Schaub is an impending unrestricted free agent. Matt Sims, who was on the practice squad, was not re-signed to a future deal, which basically makes him a street free agent. So I don't know. There's like a window when you can basically re-sign all your practice squad players, and I don't know when that window is up, but I'm pretty sure it's like a week after your season ends. So I think that window is probably closed. So he's probably free to go to San Francisco or wherever. So obviously, if one of the big questions is going to be whether or not Matt Schaub is re-signed. I think the Falcons probably would want him back, but I think Schaub has said to ESPN in the past week that he wants to compete for a starting job somewhere. Obviously, that's not going to be in Atlanta. So, people have speculated that he might go to San Francisco and be the sort of the seat warmer there for whoever the 49ers bring in to Kyle Shanahan. That makes sense in my eyes. We got a mailbag question about Schaub. Evan Birchfield asks, if Schaub goes to San Francisco, what kind of backup quarterback would you prefer we go after?
I'm gonna go with Aaron on this one with his thought that the backup quarterback needs to do something a little different than what the starting quarterback does. I want Atlanta to go out there and get Geno Smith, because I feel like if Geno Smith could be behind a guy like Matt Ryan, who actually knows how to play the position, he could end up being a very solid backup. I don't think he'd be a great starter in the NFL like I did when he was coming out, but I think at a minimum you would have one of the better backups in the NFL. And you'd have a guy who in this offense could run those rollouts effectively, could run those, simple step drops and run those zone read wrinkles the way you want them to where if Matt Ryan did go down, you at least feel like there's a structure around him to where he could have some success.
Yeah. To that point, it's one of those things where I think a lot of NFL teams make mistakes where they go out and get these sort of game managers as their backup quarterbacks. And it makes sense when it's a guy like Schaub, who's, started 7-8 years in the NFL, and you're like, okay, he can run an offense competently. But some of the Kellen Moores of the world and stuff like that, the Kellen Clemenses of the world, whereas like these guys never showed that they could run an NFL offense competently. Why would you want them as your backups? Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think given the drop off that normally happens from a starting quarterback to a backup, I think it's better to sort of have a guy that can sort of just, go out there and just be this sort of high variance player, as they say, just kind of run around and make plays and do all this crazy stuff. It may not be reliable snap to snap, but I think it gives you the better chance of win. It's a lot similar to what we had when we had Dominic Davis here. And, I don't think Davis was quite up to level where we needed him to sort of fill that role, but that's sort of the idea behind it. As far as the Falcons going backup quarterback this year, I think this is the time where the Falcons should draft a quarterback. I think the time is perfect for that opportunity. You have a new offensive coordinator coming in. Matt Ryan, there's no sort of idea that Matt Ryan is in danger of losing his job coming off of an MVP season. He's going to get a contract extension at some point in the next 6 to 7 months. That's going to make him, if not the number one highest paid quarterback in the league, but probably number 2, number 3 at the worst. So like that issue that people I think have been sort of having problems with the Falcons drafting a young quarterback because of it's a shot across the bow of Matt Ryan, I think is sort of mitigated at that point. You have a new quarterback coach. You just basically have this. If you're not going to draft a rookie quarterback, when are you going to do it? I think this year is as good a time as any. I know it's not a great draft class, but take a flyer on some late round guy that you like that's athletic, it has a big arm or whatnot, and go out and you could sign a Geno Smith. I'm not against that or anything. Some sort of cheap veteran to keep the seat warm in that way. So I think that's what I would like to see the Falcons do. But I'd
love to see him take Josh Dobbs in like the 6th or 7th round. That'd be beautiful.
Yeah. Dobbs is the type of dude I'm thinking about. He's a project, but you can afford a project because Matt Ryan's contract extension is pretty much going to guarantee that he's the Falcons starter for at least 4 years. So, that's about the same time that your rookie's contract would expire. So you have basically 4 years to develop him.
Yeah. And worst case scenario, say you take a guy like Dobbs, he turns out to be a guy like, I don't know, Jason Garrett for his career, where he can be that high variance, run the offense effectively kind of guy. If you look at Jason Garrett's career, he was Troy Aikman's backup his entire career. That's all he did. And he was only there because of how smart he was and how good he was when he was able to run the limited time while Aikman was out. He played behind him from 93 to 99 for 7 years. And then he went to go be a backup for the Giants, and then he went to go be a backup for the Bucks, and then the Dolphins after that. So, if you can get that guy And I think you can out of a guy like Josh Dobbs. You've got a guy who can not throw the game away and then is ridiculously smart because Dobbs was an aerospace engineering major. So a guy who's ridiculously smart that you can take and put behind Ryan for a couple of years. And, if Ryan goes down for 3 or 4 games, the guy can still win a couple of games. Because when in '98, when Garrett had to start those games, the Cowboys didn't do bad at all. When he started those games, those 5 games went 3-2.
Yeah. I mean, Garrett's one of those players that I think is legitimately one of those guys that I was just referring to, where he's a sort of a game manager type, but he was actually a good game manager type. I just think the league is chock full of bad game managers that people think, oh yeah, he knows my offense and he can run it, but then when they actually get on the field, they just are terrible. But Garrett is the exception to that, or was the exception to that. Yeah, so I think that's what the Falcons. That's what I would want to do. Want to see the Falcons do. Obviously, this is not a deep quarterback draft class. There's about 6 competent quarterback prospects in this draft, and then it's basically you're just kind of hoping that somebody bubbles up to the surface that's decent that can make your team. But I think this is the time is right for that to happen. And if not, then the Falcons should have plenty of options. Mark Sanchez, I know he's played under Steve Sarkisian. I wouldn't mind Mark Sanchez being the backup. He's not very good, but at this point, it's between him and a rookie like Josh Dobbs. You probably have a better shot at winning a game with Sanchez back there. So, the Falcons have options. Geno Smith is fine. I'm good with that as well. So we'll see what happens.
And I feel like the offense could be in a situation where Sanchez wouldn't have to make the dumbass throws he was making in Philly or the dumbass throws he was making in New York, because they were relying on him. Here, there'd be a running game. There'd be a top receiver. You have guys who can actually get open, unlike some of those teams. I mean, bigger question is what happens with another position. So if Schaub's gone, that's fine. But I mean, I don't even mind the idea of taking both Sanchez and taking Schaub or taking Dobbs in the 7th round.
Yeah. And you're right, Scott. I have an issue with these bad game management backups. But here in Atlanta, when you have a Julio Jones, when you have our running game, when you got guys, if our offense is just basically going to be screens to Sanu and screens to Gabriel, that's not the worst opportunity for someone who just quote unquote manages the game. So it could work here in Atlanta, unlike a lot of other teams. But, I prefer a guy that can sort of do a little bit more than just sort of check downs. All right, let's move on to the running back position. Now, this is the position, at least at the tailback spot, pretty much it's business as usual. Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman, Teron Ward are all coming back. The biggest issue here going into the offseason is Patrick DeMarco, who's a unrestricted free agent, as well as whether or not the Falcons are going to give that big money to Devontae Freeman. Obviously, he talked about that going into the week leading up to the Super Bowl of wanting to get paid like a top 3 running back in this league. Scott, I'm curious, do you think this offseason is the right time? Do you think Devontae is worth that much money? And do you think this offseason is the right time to pay him?
I would pay Devontae probably 6.5, 7 a year, which to me is perfectly fine. I think he's worth it. I, for the longest time, thought all these running backs were just functions of their offense and you could find a running back wherever and all that. I had a 2nd-round grade on Devontae Freeman. The fact that he fell to the 4th, I was pounding on my own table at my house. Take Devontae Freeman. I was screaming it at the TV. Same thing with Tevin Coleman. Like, I had a 1st-round grade on Tevin Coleman. When I saw him there in the 3rd round, I was like, fucking take Coleman. Like, it's either Coleman or a pass rusher. Like, I don't care what you take, but take one of them. and they took Coleman. So I was like, fuck yeah. So when it comes to the running backs, I'm excited, but you need talent at running back. And when you got a talent like Devontae Freeman who can catch, who can run, who can block, who's great in the scheme, and they're not changing from the outside zone. So when you got that kind of thing, at this point, what do? You've got to keep at least one of them. And I think Tevin, despite being a different kind of back in some ways, is basically just Devontae if he was taller, skinnier, could run faster, and wasn't as good of a pass blocker. Like, they can both run effectively. They can both catch effectively. I don't think Coleman's as good of a pass blocker as Freeman is. But outside of that, I mean, I think you've got two good running backs. But I feel like Coleman is replaceable. And when I go back and I watch and see what the Saints did, when Reggie Bush left, they just went out and got Darren Sproles. When Sproles left, they went out and got these guys who can do a lot of the same stuff, but they didn't have to have near the investment in them. Like, the Saints always have a multi-faceted running back, like a CJ Spiller. Like, right now they got Daniel Lasco who can do all that. So it's more of how do you make sure you keep the primary guy? And that's the one that matters, and that guy is Devontae Freeman. You can find change of paces. You can't find that primary guy.
Fair point, Scott. I sort of agree with you. I think Coleman has a extreme value to this team, but I would agree with you. All things being equal, if you're talking about which one of those two guys is probably more replaceable at this point, like if you replace Devontae with a lesser version of Devontae, I don't think he would be very effective. If you replace Tevin Coleman with a lesser version of him, then I do think you can find that guy more easily, and he can still be somewhat effective in this offense. For me, with Devontae, like, I would be hesitant right now to pay him. If I'm being completely honest, I'm not a huge believer in giving running backs second contracts in sort of principle. But and for me, I just don't see the value of sort of paying him now. I would give him another year. I would want to wait and see how much growth, if any, Coleman shows this next year. And then if Devontae sort of proves that he can still be that 1,000-yard rusher and still be the guy that toasts the rock, then I have no problem giving him a top 3 running back contract next offseason. Particularly if it was one structured similar to like the Doug Martin contract, which was basically like a 2-year, $15 million deal, as opposed to the 5-year, $35 million deal that he signed. That's really the situation with Devontae and his money. But at the same time, like, if the Falcons decided to pay him that type of money now, you're just basically making the same sort of deal a year earlier. So I wouldn't complain about it. I wouldn't say it's a bad move or anything like that, but I would just, if I could kick it to next year, then I would do so. Yeah, I mean, like, it's a situation where I think at that spot, if the Falcons can find a late round running back that is that they feel like can sort of combine the skill sets of the two, that has like Devontae's sort of vision and shiftiness, along with a little bit of Coleman's explosiveness, in the later portion of the draft, I think that's be worthwhile draft pick for them to take a flyer out. I don't think it's a need at this point, because I do think Teron Ward, we don't talk about much, but I think he showed a lot of growth from his rookie year into this second year in Atlanta, even though he only had limited opportunities, but I think he made the most of those. So I do feel comfortable with Teron Ward as the third running back, but if there's a possibility to upgrade that spot, then I would be all for it.
If there was any possibility to upgrade it, I think it's with TJ Logan. He does a lot of the same stuff that guys like Tevin Coleman and Devontae Freeman can do. I think he's got burner speed, but I also think that he could return kicks and return punts effectively. And I know you're probably like, well, that's not that important to worry about, Scott. But if he can do what Tevin does and what Devontae does, and one of them goes down with an injury like they have in the past, you still need that second guy that can come right in and do what Tevin does and do what Devontae does, because that's what makes the offense roll. And you got at least two guys that you can always bring in at running back, and the defense knows nothing about what you're doing, regardless of who's in there, because they can all catch pass or pass block, at least at a substitute replacement level, you know?
Yeah,
And
no, I get that. Yeah, A, I don't sound like that, or at least I don't think I do. But B, yeah, my issue with drafting guys for return spots is only that if basically their only chance of making the roster is if they win the return job, then I think that's a waste of a draft pick. Like, I
so
think
you
you
don't
have.
look at Dorier Jackson for the Falcons.
I don't know who that is.
He's a cornerback, wide receiver that's been
Oh, you
linked to
talking
the
about the USC
Falcons
guy?
quite a bit.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
from Southern Cal, and he doesn't play cornerback particularly well. He doesn't play wide receiver particularly well, but he's a fucking monster returner.
Yeah, I mean, like to me, like you look at the Devin Hester situation. I mean, Devin Fuller situation last year. Like, and it differs from a situation like Tyreek Hill in Kansas City, where Tyreek Hill was basically could have won was expected to win the number 4 spot at their wide receiver position because basically Kansas City has terrible wide receivers. But you look at the situation here in Atlanta, the Falcons don't have terrible wide receivers, especially if they can sort of retain some of the guys that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But it's like, you're basically going to have to come in. If you draft the Falcons draft a kick returner that plays wide receiver, he's going to have to come in right away and outplay guys like Justin Hardy and outplay guys like Alger Robinson. And that's just not really likely, especially for a late round guy. That's darn near impossible. Maybe you strike gold with a super dynamic guy like Tyreek Hill, but even that is a iffy proposition, especially when you consider sort of Hill's off-field baggage. So like that to me is an extreme gamble. And then you look at the depth of the Falcons at cornerback situation. And then, even if you go out and get a running back and you're like, well, this guy's better than Teron Ward, maybe, but Teron Ward, can give you X amount of ability as a pass protector. He's a functional running back that can be productive, in the scheme. So you're basically having to bet on a guy to come in right away and prove that he is a good NFL backup running back. And the truth of the matter is, even though there are success stories for rookies that come in the league right away and are highly successful, like an Alfred Morris, like a Zeke Elliott, that isn't as common as people sort of think it is. And so, like, to me, drafting a guy just so you can be your returner, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, I just think you wait till, it's similar to fullback. Like, I don't think you draft fullbacks. Doesn't mean that fullback isn't an important position, but it's just not worth your draft capital to draft a guy when you can just get a perfectly functional fullback in the undrafted market or on the street. And it's the same thing to me with the kicker returner. We saw that with J.D. McKissick this past year, where basically this guy we found in undrafted free agency came in and practically won the kickoff return job. So, like, I just don't think teams should be investing significant money in kicker returners. And even with a guy like Hill, where he was probably the best returner in the league this year, what are the Chiefs excited about? Are they excited about the 3 return touchdowns? Or are they excited about the fact that he basically became their number 2 wide receiver by the end of the year? And they're, outside of Travis Kelce, was their most potent offensive weapon. Like, I don't think they really care about his return skills. So it's just one of those things where, like, I don't see any value to drafting a guy that, can be a returner. It doesn't have that much value to me in the NFL anymore.
The guy who can be a returner and catch out of the backfield and run out of the backfield, at least starting out. I think Logan's kind of a really shitty blocker right now, but as a running back and as a receiver out of the backfield, he's worth having as at least a third back, because you can teach a guy how to pass block. he's not a bad pass blocker because he's not trying. He's a bad pass blocker because he has no idea what the hell he's doing. You can fix stupid in technique. You can't fix stupid in want to. And like understanding that, hey, he at least needs to chip these guys. But if a guy doesn't do well chipping them off the edge and doesn't know what he's really doing, chipping them off the edge, that's technique. That's not, that's not lack of trying. That's not lack of wanting to get better. So I'll take a guy like TJ Logan who can do it all, just may not be the best at any of it right now.
Okay. I haven't seen that guy, so I can't comment specifically about him. I just, from my perspective, it just seems like the Falcons don't really have an opportunity. And like, unless basically Robinson leaves and, in some sort of weird situation where Taylor Gabriel's gone, it just doesn't, I don't see the opportunity for a return guy to make this team. Like, I just think you're just basically going to have a Devin Fuller situation all over again. Now, maybe that guy, unlike Fuller, maybe that guy doesn't get hurt and winds up being this great, amazing return specialist, and you get the payoff in your investment. But, again, in today's NFL, how much value is that? Like, for the Chiefs, yeah, Hill is, his 3 return touchdowns is a huge value because their offense is terrible. But, so those 3 scores matter. But for the Falcons, who shouldn't have any problem generating points, it's just, I don't see the upside as much as other people seem to see it.
Well, again, for me, it's not that I'm upgrading returner. It's that I'm upgrading multiple spots. I'm upgrading returner. I'm upgrading third running back at the same time. And if we really want to go there, why is Eric Weems on the roster, and why isn't our homeboy Taylor Gabriel the one that's doing everything in terms of the return game?
Well, if you want to ask why Eric Weems is the returner versus Eric Weems is on the roster, those are 2 different answers. Eric Weems is on the roster because he's our best special teams coverage guy. He led the team with 15 tackles this year. And, basically in his entire NFL career in Atlanta, when he's been the personal protector for the punter, there's only been 1 blocked punt in his lifetime. Now, I think it happened last year. So, like, basically, he is a great special teams player. That's why he's on the roster. Now, why is he returning kicks? I think it's because he's a known commodity there. He doesn't fumble. He's had maybe like 3 fumbles in 9 years of returning kicks and punts combined. He's like, I think the numbers, I crunched them not that long ago, and it's like he fumbles like on like 0.4% of his touches. That's why he gets the job, because they know he's not going to turn the ball over. And the value of getting a guy that is going to consistently get you 8 to 10 yards on a punt and not muff it, and a guy that can get you 20 yards on average on a kickoff return has value. It may not have as much value as a guy that can take it 90 yards to the house, but, I think that's the reason why he's there. Now, is that going to keep him there? Probably not, but I think that's why he's been able to hold down that job.
I would have much rather seen Taylor Gabriel as the returner.
I don't disagree with you on that one, but I think at a certain point when it's like, well, if Gabriel, given how much value he was offering to the offense, and putting him on punts is going to, diminish that even 5%. Like I'd rather just keep Taylor Gabriel doing his thing on offense. And we've known, historically speaking, when you take a great returner and you put him on offense, he tends to struggle as a returner. It's just not a whole lot of guys have a lot of energy to do both at a high level. You can either be a great wide receiver or you can be a good punt returner. It generally is not a two-sorted thing. So I don't have any misgivings about Gabriel not doing it this year. Now, if we want to talk 2017, then that's a different conversation.
That's where I'm kind of like looking at this and going, well, Darren Sproles tends to return and do other stuff, but he only returns punts. So I wonder if maybe you just have Gabriel out there on punts.
Yeah, well, if Darren Sproles grew on trees, then I'd be a very rich man.
I think that's the best comparison for Gabriel right now, for what he provides to this offense.
I go probably a poor man's Antonio Brown because he also returns punts for the Steelers. So, or an Edelman who also returns punts for the Patriots. So, yeah,
Yeah,
there are guys that are successful, but those guys aren't necessarily known for their great punt returning skills. They just kind of competent at that.
which I think is exactly what you're getting out of Weems, and you don't have to waste the roster spot.
Let's talk a little bit about the fullback position. We got a mailbag question from Joe Bear 74. He asks, DeMarco was called the league's best fullback a season ago. Do we resign him or take a rookie, Rodgers or Stevenson? I'm assuming those are draft picks because I don't know.
I mean, would it be nice to have a guy who knows the offense and can do the side things and does everything he needs to do? Yeah, it'd be great. Do you draft a fullback? Fuck no. It's not worth it.
Yeah, like to me, there should be no question of whether the Falcons should resign to Patrick DeMarco. He should have been a Pro Bowler this year. He got jobbed in the voting for Mike Tolbert. He was one of the 2, if not 3 best fullbacks in the NFL. Now you can certainly come from the mindset of, well, we're moving to a different offense. It doesn't use the fullback as much. Maybe the position doesn't have as much value. And this offseason making DeMarco the highest paid fullback in the league is probably not the best idea. I don't even know what the top paid fullback in the league makes.
He won't get paid like that.
I'm assuming it's like, what, $3 million a year tops?
I mean, the top rated fullback is Mike Tolbert. And I think he makes like 3.5 a year.
Yeah. So, to me,
he's
that's
got a 2-year, $3.3 million contract. So I would pay him that in a heartbeat.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're not breaking the bank. I don't think DeMarco's going to ask for an Ovi Mahaley contract, but at this point in time, I'd even be willing to give it to him, if he wanted it. Sure. I'm not going to break up a good thing. It's been working. So why would I mess that up? The Falcons have a good running game for the first time in, 4 or 5 years. So, pay DeMarco whatever he wants and let's just keep this train moving.
It's not even just a good running game, though. This is one of the best running games out there.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I'm all for paying Patrick DeMarco. To me, the only reason that he should leave Atlanta is if some other team decides that they want to spend, all their money on a fullback, on a good blocking fullback. And I'm looking at Spotrac right now, and the top cap hit for fullbacks in 2017 is Anthony Sherman, $2.3 million. So, yeah, it's affordable, definitely. All right, so okay, let's move on to the wide receivers. We've touched on a little bit of this, talking about the returner situation, but for the most part, most of our guys are returning. Obviously, Julio Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Justin Hardy's coming back. Nick Williams, I know other places have reported him as an exclusive rights free agent, but I'm pretty sure he's under contract. Devin Fuller is coming off IR. BJ Daniels from the practice squad. Anthony Dablé, the French wide receiver that we signed to a future deal. That leaves our free agents as Taylor Gabriel, who's restricted, which, I will reiterate, as I did on Twitter a couple of days ago, there's a 99.6% chance that he comes back. And that also leaves Aldrick Robinson and Eric Williams as unrestricted free agents. But, to me, I don't think there's a concern that Gabriel's going to leave, because I think the Falcons have Dimitroff already has publicly said that they intend to sort of keep him. I'm assuming that they're going to give him at least that second round tender, which is going to be about a 1-year, $2.8 million contract. I guess I'm curious, Scott, do you think the Falcons should be content with giving Gabriel that 1-year deal and then seeing what happens next year? Or do you think they should try to lock him up long-term this offseason?
I would try to lock him up longer term this offseason. I think you already see what he can do. And I think that you know how to work them in, and if Matt Ryan's getting as much control of the offense as it seems like he's going to, you want to work him in because that means screens are going to come back in a big way, and you need a guy who can come in and run that screen opposite of Julio and be just as scary.
Fair enough. Look, I'm a big fan of Taylor Gabriel, but I don't think it makes sense to pay him long-term money. Basically, after about half a season of production, I think you give him that 1-year deal and you see what happens. And if he repeats that production in 2017, then you pay him. If he doesn't, then you can walk away knowing that he's not to say that he's not good or anything like that, but he is kind of a replaceable player. He's an expendable piece. Because for a portion of the season, Aldrick Robinson and Justin Hardy were able to sort of fill that number 3 spot behind Sanu and Julio. Obviously not to the same level that Gabriel did, but I think you can go out and get a guy that can sort of do 70% of what Taylor Gabriel does for probably potentially, depending on what his price tag ultimately is, for a lot less than 70% of the price. So I wouldn't pay him long-term this offseason, especially also considering the fact that, every year that he's been good, it's been with Kyle Shanahan calling the plays. No other offensive coordinator has shown an ability to effectively maximize his ability yet. And so I wouldn't pay him until Sarkisian proves that he can do that. So for me, I think you give him the 1-year deal and you see what happens.
I almost kind of hope that they give him that 1-year deal and then the 49ers sign him long-term and gladly give up that high second-round pick for him. I know it's not going to happen, but I would thoroughly enjoy that idea because I feel like at that pick, you may not get the slot receiver you want, but you might find a guy like David Njoku sitting right there. And if you put Njoku in the slot, you've got a big tight end who might be able to run that Jimmy Graham type role, which I think would be more valuable anyway. But
yeah, I just look at it and I look at the free agency market and I'm like not looking to replace Taylor Gabriel, but I look at a guy like Marcus Wheaton, who's sort of a buy low guy right now. And I'm like, well, there's a possibility, not necessarily Wheaton specifically, but there's always a couple of Marcus Wheaton types available in free agency. And I don't feel like you need to spend all that much money to get a Taylor Gabriel type of money that requires a long-term deal. Now, again, if he goes out and plays another and has another repeat of what he did this past season, next season, then yeah, I'd be much more willing to pay him long-term. But until he does that, I wouldn't basically decide, oh, we want to be locked into this guy for the next 2 to 4 years because he had, 6 really great games in the second half of this past season. But, I don't want anybody to make that sound like I think Gabriel's not good or anything like that. I do really like him. But I just don't want to pay him. So moving on to the other unrestricted free agents who I think is a much higher chance of not being in the Falcons this upcoming season. You very much made it known that you think the Falcons should move on from Eric Weems. I think that's a fair opinion at this point in his career. What about Aldrick Robinson? Do you feel like if he wants to come back, do you want him to come back, or are you sort of expecting him to head out west to San Francisco to join Kyle Shanahan over there?
I would be fine with Aldrick Robinson leaving. I don't think he's that important.
Okay. Obviously he with the emergence of Gabriel, particularly in the second half of the season, his role in Atlanta was lessened. I think, with Robinson, he's similar to Gabriel, where all his success in the NFL has been under a Kyle Shanahan coached offense. So my expectation is that he will join the 49ers because I don't expect the Falcons to offer him more than sort of a 1-year minimum contract that they gave him this past offseason. I do like Alec Robinson. I do think he has a role on this league and on this team, and I think having a vertical threat like him is certainly valuable to the offense, but obviously is not as huge an issue for the Falcons because of Julio and Gabriel coming back, and I do think you can sort of find another guy that can sort of do that to a certain extent in the future. So if Robinson winds up leaving, then I wish him the best. If he winds up staying, then I think he can still provide a role for the Falcons. But at this point, I think you sort of offer him the 1-year minimum, 1 year, maybe $900K or whatever that is, and then that's about it.
That's all I would do.
So let's say Robinson and Weems are gone. Do you feel like the Falcons have a need at wide receiver with Jones, Sanu, Hardy, and Gabriel being their top 4 guys? Are you comfortable with the Nick Williams, Devin Fuller, BJ Daniels, Anthony Doble sort of being the primary competitors for that number 5 spot?
I mean, yeah. Maybe bring in some undrafted free agents. Maybe take a guy in like the 6th or 7th round, like an Isaiah McKenzie, who showed that he could burn a team deep on offense, and then could also run as a returner. Like, if you're going to take a receiver, you're going to take a guy who can do what Eric Weems does and what Aldrick Robinson does, and try and get that in one player.
Okay. We got a couple of mailbag questions pertaining to the receivers, not necessarily to the offseason. They're about Julio. Brian at your homie Brian asks, how would you rank Julio Jones among all-time great wide receivers? I think he's the greatest Falcon of all time.
He might be the best Falcons receiver of all time. As far as all-time greatest NFL receivers, if he can continue what he's doing, he is a top 10 receiver all time.
Yeah, like I obviously I didn't see all the Falcons receivers throughout their history, but I have a hard time imagining that peak Alfred Jenkins and those guys were better than what Julio is right now. So I think it's fair to say that he is the best Falcon receiver of all time. I think the only thing that you would prevent him from saying that is just because he hasn't had quite as many peak seasons as a guy like Roddy White, who is atop the Falcons record books. Roddy had like 6 peak years from 2007 to 2012, and Julio's really only had 4, 2012, 2014, 2015, and 2016. So that would be the only argument, I think, against putting Julio as the greatest Falcon of all time. I certainly think you can, body of work wise, obviously I don't think Julio belongs in the conversation of the greatest wide receivers for similar reasons, but I do think in terms of his actual ability, we are watching a Hall of Fame wide receiver. It's just going to be a question of whether or not, he has the longevity to sort of solidify his status as a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, I mean, if he gets 1,500 yards this coming year, you're looking at a guy who goes from 104th all time, so right around 56th where Vincent Jackson is. In his 7th year, he'll do what Vincent Jackson did in 11. And then if you give him another year, he can do in 8 years what Marcus Colston did in a decade, what Welker did in 12 years, basically. Like, you're looking at a guy who might be able to beat what Roddy White did in an 11-year career in just 8 years, if he has 2 more seasons like what he just had this year. That's how good Julio Jones is. That's how good he has been. I mean, we could be looking at a guy who, when he's all said and done, he's up there with the likes of the Larry Fitzgeralds, the Andre Johnsons, the Calvin Johnsons, the Steve Smiths, the Randy Mosses, the Terrell Owens, the Jerry Rices of the world. Like a true Hall of Fame receiver. I think that's how good he is. He might be one of the 10 best wide receivers of all time. That's how good he is. And I'm saying that if he can continue on the path that he's on. Now, I'm with Aaron in terms of as raw, unadulterated talent, you're looking at Terrell Owens and Randy Moss, who are the only two guys who I would say have the same league of the raw, unadulterated talent. And like Calvin Johnson, where they've got the size, they've got the speed, they're not afraid to push people around in the middle of the field. They're willing enough as blockers. Like, yeah, you might have some diva tendencies in some of these guys, but the best of the best. Like, even Isaac Bruce didn't have that kind of athletic ability. He was just around a long time. Tim Brown never had that athletic ability. Steve Smith was great, but didn't have the size that Julio had. In terms of just the all-time freaks of the league, you've got Terrell Owens, Julio Jones, Randy Moss, and Calvin Johnson.
Fair enough. Speaking of Julio's longevity, our next question is from Mark L. Jefferson. He asks, I'm getting worried about Julio and this foot, in parentheses, screw, being, think 2 to 3 years may be the max for Julio.
He already broke it once. What are we going to do? What's going to happen next if he breaks it again? Just break it a third time. Like, he hasn't actually broken his bone in the foot yet. Since he's broken 2 screws, but not the actual bone in his foot since he broke those screws. Like, since he broke the bone. So who knows with Julio? If he gets injured again, it happens. It's Julio Jones. He's always fighting some injury. It sucks. It's kind of frustrating, but it's a damn screw in his foot. Like, he's already played 7 seasons with it. Or sorry, 6 seasons with it. Not even full 7.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is going to be a concern with Julio. As Robert Mays has termed it, he's a centaur. He's a guy that you can certainly make a strong case, given his body of work, going back to his days at Alabama, that he's too gifted and his body just isn't quite able to handle the torque and explosiveness that he is capable of. And he gets a lot of these nagging injuries. I think he played this entire season at somewhere between 70 and 90%. So, like, this is going to be an issue moving forward. And I do think there is a concern that, we're sitting here, I think, Julio's 27, 28. And, we're just sort of assuming that he's going to play a long time in Atlanta. That may not be the case. Like, he might only have 2 or 3 more good years in him. And then, it's similar to Roddy and he just sort of falls off a cliff because the injuries sort of drag him down. I do expect those 2 to 3 years to happen, though. But, yeah, I mean, the issue isn't necessarily with Julio. It's just you got to have quality wide receiver depth. You just spent $32 million last offseason to get a guy that can sort of be the number one if and when Julio goes down. We drafted Justin Hardy. We have Taylor Gabriel. Potentially, we'll see what happens with Aldrick Robinson. But, like, the Falcons aren't done at wide receiver. We may not see major moves at that position this year, but there's a very good possibility that you'll see a major investment at that position in the offseason of 2018 to sort of mitigate any of these issues. So we'll have to see with Julio, however long he can give us playing the way that he's been playing in these last couple of years. I'll certainly be thankful for. I'm expecting it might only be 2 or 3 years, but if that's 2 or 3 years of watching Julio be Julio, then that's 2 or 3 years that I will learn to appreciate. All right, let's wrap this thing up with this positional review by talking about the tight ends. For the most part, all of our young guys are returning. Austin Hooper, Josh Perkins, DJ Tialavea, Darian Griswold, and Brian Vogler. The 2 big free agents are Jacob Tamme and Levine Toilolo. Scott, I'm curious, do you think the Falcons should resign either Tamme or Toilolo this offseason?
It depends on what they want. I would completely sign Toilolo if he would do a deal like what Tamme had the last 2 years. I would be perfectly fine re-signing Tamme to that same deal. Anything more than that, they can go fly a kite. They can go hang out in San Francisco. And if they don't re-sign either, I mean, you've got options. You can go to free agency. You can get a guy like Marty Bennett. You could go to the draft. There's like 6 tight ends in the draft that would be instant upgrades. You might even get someone insane like, I don't know, OJ Howard to come to this team who has that high-end ceiling of a Tony Gonzalez type that could actually block. So, I mean, as far as tight end is concerned, if those two don't want to take the deal that you hand them, just take someone else.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, I would be open to both Tammy and Toilolo re-signing with the team because I do think they're competent role players, but I do feel like the Falcons can really definitely upgrade that spot this all season. As you mentioned, it's a very deep tight end class in this draft. I think you have a better than expected tight end crop that's going to be in free agency. I think you're going to see guys like Martellus Bennett. I think you're going to see guys like Julius Thomas. You're going to see guys like Jack Doyle, among others, hit the market, and you'll have options there. So I do feel like the Falcons' probably best stance. I think with Tammy coming off of the injury, and it sounds like when he got hurt, that he wasn't going to be ready until like after the draft to return to practice. I don't feel like you need to be in a rush to go out and sign him. So I think you can sort of wait in a similar way that we waited on Chris Chester last offseason. I think with Toilolo, you can just sort of let him go out and test his market. Maybe the 49ers offer him decent money. Maybe another team goes out and offers him decent money to be their blocking tight end. And if that happens, then, you know, maybe you have an opportunity to match if it's a modest deal. But I think you can sort of – he's a expendable piece. And so if that's the case, then all of a sudden now you're in the market to get, you know, one of these mid-level free agent tight ends and draft a guy, which I would like to see the Falcons do, just given how deep this draft class is, and getting another young tight end that they can sort of build around for the future. Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, if we come back next season and it's Hooper, Perkins, Tammy, and Toilolo, I'm fine with that. I wouldn't be thrilled about it, but I'm fine with it. And if, you know, it's just Hooper, Perkins, and 2 new guys, 1 new guy, then I'll be perfectly happy with that as well. So, yeah, you know, I'd be for re-signing both guys, but it's not a priority in my opinion.
I do think that Hooper is the instant starter no matter what. Unless they like draft OJ Howard in the first round or like Njoku, I think Hooper is the guy that they're going to start at number 1 tight end. He can block, he can catch. He gives Ryan someone he's comfortable with. And I think that there's going to be more featuring tight ends this year than there was once Tammy went down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's probably why I wouldn't expect them to use a number 1 pick on a tight end, but certainly on day 2, I think that would probably be the case. I do think the team probably wants to see what they have in Perkins next season as well. So I don't necessarily know if it's going to be a huge priority. They might wind up just going out and getting somebody that can block, since Hooper and Perkins have enough upside in the receiving game that you would just think, okay, all we really need is a blocker that can come in and push Tia for that spot. So I do think the Falcons are in a good position with the tight end, even if they didn't really do anything. I just think there's so much room for growth there that you could really go from an area of the roster that is good, but could be great next season if they made a couple of smart upgrades. All right, we got several more mailbag questions, so let's get into that and wrap this thing up. Our first one was a question we got asked last week that we didn't see. It's from Digital Demon. He says, do you think guard and defensive end should be our top priority in free agency, then D tackle and tight end to be the top priority in the draft?
Based on the strength of what I've seen in free agency versus the draft, or draft versus free agency, if I'm playing the odds, I go guard and defensive tackle in free agency because I think you get better options at tackle. And I do think I would go tight end and defensive tackle in free agency because I think that you could get a seasoned guy. You could just re-sign Tammy and Toilolo. and just go with what you had this year. Or you could go with a guy like Marty Bennett, or you could bring in a guy like Jared Cook, just a tight end that likes to be flexed out, and you don't really have to worry about their blocking because you're not going to use them on the field as a tight end, really. So someone like that would be a good fit. And then a defensive tackle, because I feel like this is one of the strongest edge classes I've ever seen. And I feel like if you really want to go guard, there's probably 3 guys you can get in the first and second round that would all do excellent in the zone scheme. You got Forrest Lamp, who'd be probably the perfect second round pick. You got Dan Feeney, who, if you take at 31, I don't think there's a single person here who would be complaining with that. You might have like someone like Aaron who sits there and goes, "Why are we investing so much into the offensive line?" But I'd be okay with it, even if it's a first-round pick, because the money wouldn't be ridiculous as the way it would be for a free agent guard that would upgrade Chester like a Zeitler would. And I think Feeney would be a way better pass blocker. So, I mean, taking a guy like him, or a guy from LSU named Ethan Pocic, who would be perfect, or Posick or whatever, Pocic. I'm going to mess that one up every time because I don't know what fucking country it comes from. But yeah, someone like him to play guard too would work. He played center at LSU for quite a few years, for the last 3 years. He's good with protections. He understands what he's supposed to do in blitz pickup. He's quick enough to play in either a zone or a man scheme, and he's got power behind his butt. So when they do need those short yards, you don't have to worry about Chester getting pushed around. You'd have a guy be an upgrade over him. Take a guy like him in the second round, super cheap contracts in the second round, and just thrive by having that.
Okay, I still don't think I sound like that, but yeah, no, my issue with guard is not investment. It's more paying guys. We have so much money wrapped up in our offense, or is about to be wrapped up in our offense, that I don't feel like throwing out another $30 or $40 million contract for a free agent makes sense. If you're going to draft a guy, I don't have a problem with that. That's great investment, especially if it's in the first 2 rounds. To answer Digital Demon's question, like, I don't think guard should be a top priority in free agency, but I sort of agree, similar to what Scott's premise. I just have a different take on it. I think DE and tight end are a little stronger in draft, so I think those would be, I'd probably favor to draft guys there because it's a deep class. And, of the 2, I'd probably go guard and D tackle in free agency. I don't feel like you need to go out and spend money like guard as a top priority in free agent. I think you just get a body at that spot, and you say go out and compete with Ben Garland and Wes Schweitzer to replace Chris Chester, and you don't need to go out and spend money on a free agent, on a veteran. If you want to invest in your guard position, I think you do draft a guy like Forrest Lamp probably in the first round as opposed to the second. Yeah, that would be sort of my thought process in that. D tackle, I haven't quite looked at all the D tackles yet in the draft. I started to look at a couple. I don't think this year's class is as strong as last year's class was. So I think that was sort of a missed opportunity by the Falcons. But I do think, I don't know, like the free agent class isn't amazing at D tackle. It's probably decent, but it's not amazing. So, yeah, I probably would prefer to go for a veteran D tackle, since I think defensive tackles tend to take a little bit longer to develop than defensive ends do in terms of draft picks. But that's more of a in general thing than a specific thing to this year's draft class. But yeah, that would be my answer, I guess. Derek Hunter at D-Rock the Party, he asks, he has 2 questions. It's about our rotation in the defensive line. He asks, what do you think of this base D-line in 2017? He has at Leo, Brooks Reed and Adrian Claiborne, 3-tech D-tackle, Jared and Hageman, nose tackle, Don Terry Poe, and 5-technique Chris Wormley. And then he also asks, what do you think of this nickel D-line? And at defensive end, at one defensive end, he has Claiborne and Freeney. At D tackle, he has a rotation of Shelby, Jarrett, Hageman, Claiborne, and Wormley. And at the other DN spot, he has Beasley and Charles Harris.
I mean, the base defensive line I'd be okay with. I'd rather not spend the money on Poe, honestly. Just have Hageman play that nose tackle spot if that's what you're going to do. I think you're better off doing that than having Poe come in, and you save like $12 million a year. And then on the nickel, you would just have Shelby, Jarrett, Clay, and Wormley really rotate. Which again, that'd be fine by me. I think that's how you should do it. And then Clay and Freeney at one end. I mean, I think at defensive end, you could really just kind of throw them all in a bucket, because I think eventually you do want to get to a point where Beasley and Charles Harris would be the top two guys that you're rotating. Because Harris can rush from the right side a lot better than he can rush from the left. Clay can rush from either side. Freeney can kind of rush from either side. And Beasley rushes way better from the left than he does from the right. So I'd honestly want Harris to be on the same side as Freeney and have those two guys rotate on nickel and have Claiborne be the pure Leo. Don't even worry about Poe. If you run this line, you might even be able to get rid of Brooks Reed. Reed might kind of be replaceable at this point.
Yeah, with Poe, I love Dontari Poe as a player. I think he's one of the best D tackles in the league, but I would have an issue with signing him just because the amount of money that you're going to have to spend to get him just to me is not worth it. You know, he's a 350-pounder with a bad back. I just think that's a situation that is not going to get any better. So like that to me is spending a lot of guaranteeing a lot of money to that guy who's probably going to spend half of his time over the next 2 to 3 years nicked up and not playing and constantly being nursed in the trainer's room. It's just, to me, is not a good investment. I think Poe's a great player, and he might rebound and go on and have 3 or 4 great years, Pro Bowl sort of years. But it just, to me, it's not a smart gamble to pay him. Wormley, I haven't watched specifically yet, so I don't really have a comment on him. Other than that, like, your rotation is fine. I'd probably prefer to have Beasley and Harris as the two DNs in this situation, as Scott said, and then probably move Claiborne and Shelby and Jarrett, to be the main rotation on the inside and whatnot. So, yeah, that rotation's not I don't have a problem with that. And if in some world where the Falcons do sign Dontari Poe, I'm not going to complain about it. I just don't think it's the world's smartest investment. Jonathan Moulton asks, he's at Johnny P35. He asks, if Clay Matthews is cut, think he's worth a prove it deal?
Yeah, especially if you can cut Brooks Reed and basically just replace him with Clay Matthews for the same kind of price, as Brooks Reed made the first 2 years, and then do something like that. I think you'd be better off. So, yeah, he's worth that kind of deal. I'd sign him to a prove it deal.
I'd probably pass. I just don't see where you're going to play Clay Matthews. You're going to play him at DN. You're going to play him at
Leo.
Strong side linebacker.
Play him at Leo. You might stand your Leo up a little bit more with Clay there, but still basically the same thing as what he's been playing.
I don't know. Clay might be washed. I don't know at this point, but we'll see. I would just pass. I'd get a guy that has a little bit more of a durability issue, or less of a durability issue, and that has done a little bit more in the last couple of years than Clay has. So I would pass. Let him sign with somebody else for a prove it deal. Charlie Rogers asks, would Leary be a good fit for us? Also, thoughts on Harris from Mizzou and McKinley from UCLA.
I mean, Leary would be very, very good in Atlanta's scheme. He's already doing that, honestly. He's already playing in the zone scheme at guard. So I don't see why there'd be any other issue. When it comes to Harris from Mizzou or McKinley from UCLA, they both give me that super raw, need some technical work, defensive end kind of guy, which I'm okay with, but you got to bring back Freeney if that's what you're going to do, because you need a guy who can rush now, not a guy who you can rush tomorrow.
Okay, interesting. I don't know about Leary. And let me be clear, I'm not really basing this off of extensive watching him this past season, but from what I remember of him, watching a little bit more of him in 2014 when he was a starter, I wouldn't say he's a great fit for our outside zone scheme. Like, they do run a lot of zone in Dallas, but it's not quite the same as what ours ask him to do. He's more of a power pig as opposed to sort of that athlete that you want climbing to the second level and whatnot. So unless we really sort of ran a lot more, we ran inside zone as much as we run outside zone now, I don't know if he's as great a fit as people think he is, but maybe he's gotten better at that in 2016 that I just haven't noticed quite to the degree. I'm not watching, when I'm watching Dallas, I'm watching Zeke and Zach Martin more so than Ronald Leary. But yeah, so good player, but I don't know if he's he's going to be as good as people think in Atlanta. As for Harris and McKinley, I have watched those guys recently. I like Harris. I think he's probably the best, from what I've seen, the best pure pass rusher after Myles Garrett in this draft class. So I do think he could probably come in and be sort of that immediate guy that you're talking about, not necessarily being a guy that's going to come in and get 10 sacks, but I certainly think he can sort of hold his own as a nickel pass rusher from the jump. McKinley, I think, is a little raw in that sense, a little bit more of a project. I don't know if McKinley has that sort of upside to be that high-level producer. I think he could be productive if he's like the player I compare him to a little bit is like Whitney Merciless. And I think when you have Merciless playing with guys like Watt and Clowney, and he's like the third best guy, then I think that that makes the most sense for Merciless. I know Merciless is playing much better now, but it's like 4 or 5 years into his career. So I think McKinley has that potential, but I do think there's a little bit more of a longer developmental time with him if you're expecting him to be this impact pass rusher down the road. All right. Joshua Hammond at Whisper 2000 asks, should the Falcons bring back Upshaw and Tyson Jackson?
All depends on the contract. I say cut Tyson Jackson because I think you can find a guy in this draft that can play his role pretty easily. And then Upshaw, if he can sign a fair contract, I'd rather have Upshaw play strong side defensive end than Jackson this year. I feel like Upshaw did a really good job playing in a base defensive end role. Much better than he's done pretty much doing anything else. And he provided some pass rush that we weren't really expecting.
Yeah, Upshaw was a guy that I made fun of quite a bit this year, but I think by the end of the season he was certainly producing. I think if you can get him at like a deal similar to what we sort of signed with Corey Bierman, like a 1 year, $1 million deal next year, then I think it's worth it. If he's wanting more than that, then I don't think it's really worth it at that point. Tyson Jackson, if he was willing to basically play for the veteran minimum, if we cut him and he was like, yeah, I'll come back on a 1 year veteran minimum deal, I don't see why you wouldn't do that just to have a guy into camp. But I think at this point in time, like, you can sort of replace him. And I think Hageman can do pretty much exactly what you want Jackson to have done this past season. So I don't feel like it's a position that you really need to address. Matt Stars asks, what I want you to chat about Keanu Neal taking the next step. If comparing to Cam, how is he used? More blitzes. Also, with his violent style, is it a matter of time before he gets nicked up? And he says Willie Moe and Cam as examples of the guys I guess that got nicked up.
I mean, he already got nicked up this past year a couple of times. So, I mean, it's going to happen. I'm not really worried about that. He's used basically how Cam Chancellor's used. He's used the way John Lynch was used during his career. I've gone back and watched some of the Tampa 2 stuff, and even though Lynch did run a lot of Tampa 2, he also ran a lot of robber alert zones the way Neal's used. Now, Neal does a little bit more man-to-man than either of those guys did, and he's a little bit better at it than what I remember either of those guys being, but he does a good job here in Atlanta. Now, more blitzes. I mean, we might see a couple more blitzes from Neal here and there, but I'm noticing that Dan Quinn doesn't like to blitz his safeties. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. And then violent style, a matter of time before he gets nicked up. Yeah. I mean, is he like Willie Moore or Cam? He'll miss some games.
Yeah, I think with, comparing a direct comparison to Keanu and Cam Chancellor, I think Scott's right. Keanu plays a lot more man. I think Seattle plays a lot. They try to mix it up a little bit more this season than they did in the past, but they have been predominantly a zone team, and sort of Keanu plays probably played more man this past season than Cam played the last 2 years combined. It seemed like. So, I think that changes the differences, and I think Keanu has shown, I think Cam Chancellor is an underrated guy in terms of man coverage, but I certainly think Keanu has shown an ability to play at a reasonably high level there much earlier in his career than Cam Chancellor did. I do think more blitzes from Keanu is in the future, but it sort of depends on all these other things going right. And obviously, ideally, if the Falcons can start getting pressure with 4 guys a little bit more easily, then they won't have to rely on the blitz as much. But I do think that's going to be a wrinkle that they will be able to mix in, especially as they get Keanu to play a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage and where he can be a little bit more, play a little faster in terms of defending the run and playing in the box. That's probably, to me, the biggest area of his game that needs to improve. The game just needs to slow down a little bit. It's not that he doesn't have the skill set to do it, but you can sort of see sometimes when you're watching the film, when it comes to filling gaps and making reads, the wheels are turning in his head. And you can sort of see that process as opposed to just reacting. When a guy like Cam Chancellor, it's like, you're not, it's just like, it's like that, he's just there. Like when you think you have him, it's like, oh no, he botched that play. As far as a matter of time before he gets nicked up, as Scott said, he had some nicks and bruises this year. It is a matter of time. It's just the nature of the position. Safety is the most injury-prone position in the NFL. It's just the nature of the position when you got guys that are 200, in the case of Keanu Neal, 210 pounds, flying around at 20 miles per hour, running headfirst into 250, 260-pound tight ends and taking on offensive linemen and running into 220-pound running backs at full speed who are also running at like 15 to 20 miles per hour. It's just, it's basically your job is to run into a brick wall all the time. And it's going to take a toll on your body. So I think it is a matter of time before we see Neal deal with injuries. Maybe it's, maybe he's relatively healthy for the next 4 or 5 years and we see him play, 15, 16 games a year. Or maybe he's a situation where he has the same issues as Willie Moe. You don't really know. And we'll just have to find out. And that's why you got to have depth. So, the Falcons can't really control how much Keanu Neal gets hurt. They just got to make sure they can control the quality of depth that they have behind them. Markel Jefferson asks, the possibility of seeing second-year and third-year players all take that next step next year, would this team be scary?
Yeah. Hell yeah, it'd be scary. If you're talking second and third year players taking that next step, you're talking Keanu Neal playing exactly the way Cam Chancellor had during his prime. You're talking about guys like oh man, Deion Jones just destroying it and being the next Bobby Wagner. You're talking about Austin Hooper going out there and at least playing like a Brent Selleck level 60 catch, 500 yard, 6 touchdown kind of season. You know, you're talking about Devondre Campbell just going insane and being one of the best weak side linebackers in the league. Hell, you might even be talking about Wes Schweitzer starting at right guard and being that upgrade over Chester that no one expected. You know, Vic Beasley, if he takes the next step, you're looking at a guy who, yeah, he may get 15 sacks instead of 15 and a half next year. But if Beasley takes that next step, he's getting those sacks against good right tackles and getting them on both sides and getting them in more than just a stunt or a rip move. You know, a standard underneath shoulder, beat him with speed move. You know, if Jalen Collins takes that next step, he's used on every possession and big receiver like Mike Evans that we face and shuts them down. And then you get Trufant back who can shut down the speed guys. And then you just have Alford who's getting picked on and picking people off. So I'm okay with that. I mean, Tevin Coleman takes the next step. I mean, what's the next step for him? 1,000 yards on 125 carries? Breaking like 375-yard runs? Like, that's the next step for Tevin Coleman. Hardy takes the next step. If Jared takes the next step, that's just him continuing what he did in the Super Bowl throughout the year. I'm not saying he's going to get 3 sacks a game in the season, but I will say that he'll get like 6-7 sacks on the year if he can play like he did in the Super Bowl every single game. And then, you know, Akeem Kim comes back from injury and looks as good as CJ Goodwin did this year, maybe better. Like, that's what you're talking about when you have these guys take second to third year jumps. If that's what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen. And even throw in Ricardo Allen. If he takes a second year to a third year jump, trust me, Ricardo Allen was a top 10 free safety in the league this year. When you go back and you watch it. That's just saying that, I mean, don't get me wrong, the free safeties in this league aren't that great. But I can only name like 8 that I would take over Allen right now. So when you look at that, you're like, all right, well, I'm not going to pay a shit ton of money. And if he makes that next step, he'll be legitimately that deserving of that grade too. So I mean, you've got these guys that can make that leap. It's just whether they do, and if they do, you're talking about insanity on offense, or insanity on offense, insanity on defense, because you're just going to have one of the best running backs in the league, one of the best receivers in the league at tight end, a good guard. You're going to have the best strong safety in the league, one of the best linebacking cores, and they're only going to be third-year guys. I mean, if they take the same jump from first year to second year that Beasley and Jarrett took from first year to second year, you're looking at just ridiculous production from those guys.
Yeah. Everything Scott said, I think, is something to look out for. I mean, you know, this, you know, my answer to this question is goes back to that earlier question about whether or not, you know, the Falcons can mitigate the Super Bowl hangover. Like, this to me is going to be the big issue in terms of less so with the coaching staff, but more so, are we going to see some of these younger guys make that jump next season? And the concern is going to be like with guys like Ricardo Allen, who've been very public with the sort of bitter taste that losing the Super Bowl left in their mouths. You know, that's not as big an issue, but some of these other guys, like, you know, the Jalen Collinses of the world and whatnot, the question is, are they going to approach it as, you know, be a little complacent this offseason, just thinking, oh, well, you know, we were a Super Bowl team, you know, so far in my first year or my second year with this team. Clearly I got this down and I don't have to work even harder to get back. And that's going to be the question facing this team this offseason. And that to me is going to be, you know, the answer to that question is going to be whether or not they sort of mitigate the Super Bowl hangover more so then the coaching staff. Obviously, the coaching staff will contribute to that and sort of try to do their best to motivate these guys to not take things for granted. I even though I may sound a little bit, skeptical of it right now, it's just, my expectation is several of these guys will make that leap. I think Neal is certainly one guy that I certainly look at, and I'm very optimistic about his future. Jarrett and Beasley are two other guys that I'm very much looking forward to seeing what they do. And there's going to be several other guys that I'm curious to see what growth they show next year as opposed to this year. Trying to predict who's going to do it, that's the hard part, because there's always a guy here or there that you're like, oh, I did not expect him to do that. And then there's a couple of guys where I thought he would be a little bit better than what he was, and he didn't live up to it. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. And, really until we get into sort of mini camps and OTAs and whatnot, and sort of hearing some feedback over which guys are playing their parts. It's a little too early to say one way or the other, but I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what happens. And on that similar note, Evan Birchfield asks, looking back at this past season, was there any player that greatly surpassed your expectations?
I mean, a lot of them. I'd say Freeman definitely surpassed my expectations. He got way less touches than I was expecting, and he did way more with them. I think Tevin Coleman surpassed my expectations. Same reason. I think Mohamed Sanu surpassed even my expectations, which weren't crazy, but I said basically like 50 catches for 600 yards and like 2 touchdowns as the number 4-ish receiving option. And he proved to be a true solid number 2. Taylor Gabriel came in, and I was ecstatic for Gabriel when they brought him in, because I thought he was really good in Cleveland and was just misused. And I think coming here showed that. And then Austin Hooper was better than I thought he'd be as a half-year starter. And Levine Toilolo, out of all the players on the team, wasn't expecting a damn thing out of him. He's on there too. And then at the end, I'd also go Matt Ryan. I wasn't expecting him to be this good. I knew he'd be better than he was in 15, but I never expected him to be this good. This was by far his best year.
Yeah. For me, Matt Ryan greatly surpassed my expectations. Tevin Coleman's impact in the passing game greatly surpassed my expectations. Gabriel, I knew Gabriel was good, but I just did not expect him to have a huge role with the Falcons, particularly as early as he did wind up having it this year. That greatly surpassed my expectations. I thought Alex Mack would be a positive addition to the offensive line, but I did not expect him to sort of solidify that unit as effectively as he did, particularly early in the season. I thought it would take a little bit of time for them to get to that level, and that greatly sort of surpassed my expectations. Defensively, not as many people sort of jumped the bar in my eyes. Deion Jones definitely would qualify for that. He played at a level much higher earlier than I expected him to. I said on I think last week's show that the player that he was throughout this past season was sort of the guy I expected him to be 2 to 3 years from now. Outside of that, not to say that other guys didn't, play better than I expected him to, but it wasn't like a huge, it wasn't out of the imagination sort of expectations and whatnot. So, Evan's next question is there any specific players you are watching for during the combine?
I mean, just all the guards, all the defensive linemen, all the tight ends, all the edge guys. If I had to be specific, Derek Barnett, Carl Lawson, Tack McKinley, Charles Harris, that entire group of guys, definitely watching them in the combine. If someone like Tim Williams does fall, I'm going to look at him. TJ Watt, I want to see how he tests, because if he tests anything like his brother did, he might be worth that first round pick. But yeah, just those kind of guys.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, at the combine, I'll be looking mostly at the edges to see how they test, because there's a pretty good, strong correlation between your athleticism and how productive a pass rusher you'll be in the NFL. Check out Justice Mosqueda. So force players to find out that information. And other than that, specifically, like I'll just be looking at some of the pit guys to see how well they test. I'm curious to see what Dorian Johnson does at guard. Adam Bisnawadi at tackle. You know, quarterbacks don't really matter, but I hope Nate Peterman has a good day. So other than that, like nobody else. Oh, Ewan Price, I'm curious how he tests, but obviously he's an edge guy. And yeah, so yeah. Evan Birchfield asks, is there any particular player expected to be a free agent you'd really want us to sign?
Is there any? Yeah, Melvin Ingram or JPP, because then you don't have to worry about getting that edge in the first round, and it gives you more flexibility in that first round. And you're not looking at just 4 guys. Where, yeah, you can go ahead and get one of those 4 guys. Like if you do get a Carl Lawson that falls, I mean, it's awesome. But, give me Carl Lawson and give me give me Lawson and give me someone else. Give me like Melvin Ingram to add to this team. And you've got a guy who can play that strong side linebacker in base, can play that Leo. You got a guy who can come in as a pass rusher. And you really have those 3 edge guys that a team like Seattle had.
Okay. Yeah. Unlike last year where there was, Alex Mack was clearly at the top of my free agent wish list, there isn't anybody yet that I've sort of seen them like, oh, yeah, I definitely want the Falcons to sign that guy. There are plenty of guys that I'm like, yeah, they'd be a good signing for the Falcons, but nobody that I'm like dead set on in terms of looking at the Falcons to get. Like there's a couple of edges that I'd be like, yeah, that'd be cool if we got them, or D tackles or whatnot, and a couple of offensive linemen and tight ends and whatnot. But nobody specifically that I'm like, oh yeah, that guy, I hope he's a Falcon one day or someday soon. So no, there isn't anybody. Evan. Evan's next question is, keep seeing some mock drafts with us taking a cornerback in the first round. Don't you think we are good at cornerback?
Very much so. The idea that the Falcons need a cornerback makes absolutely no sense to me when you look at the team and the contract situations and everything. Trufant's about to get a long-term deal. Alford's got a long-term deal. Collins is good through 2018. And you got Poole good through 2018. If you take a guy in 2018 so he can learn for a year behind Jalen and Poole and all those other guys. But I'm not seeing anywhere close to where a need is, even as like a 5th corner. Because even there, you got Goodwin and Olatoye and a couple other guys. I just don't get it. I don't see where the need is.
Yeah. I think this is a combination of it being February and nobody really having an idea of what anybody's needs are. I think there's also a combination of the Falcons cornerbacks, young cornerbacks in particular, struggling in the Super Bowl, so it's in a reaction. But obviously, people have been mocking a cornerback to the Falcons for much longer since the Super Bowl. I think part of that is because of the perception, the Falcons were relying on undrafted rookie like Brian Poole for most of the season. They can upgrade that spot. People are sort of expecting that maybe that with Alford getting paid, that maybe there's a chance the Falcons won't pay Trufant. So, I think there's a lot of confusion there. So that's why you continue to see it. I also think it's a process at this point in mock draft season. Guys aren't really sort of locking in players for teams. They're just like, here are the 32 guys I think are going to be first round picks, and just basically finding the best case situation for them, because that's really all you can do at this point. I don't think drafting a cornerback makes a lot of sense. I think we have enough youth at that spot that adding another 22-year-old to the mix is not going to really do anything. I do think you could certainly make an argument that the Falcons could use a little bit more help at cornerback, but that's more of a veteran addition. I think, the one area that they're probably weak at, and I think that was exposed to a certain extent in the Super Bowl, is they don't really have a guy that can cover a quick, fast slot guy other than Alfred or Trufant. And you want to have a backup that can do a little bit better than Brian Poole did in that Super Bowl. No offense to Brian Poole, friend of the show, but he did not have the world's best day against Danny Amendola in that game. We know Jalen Collins is not suited to guarding those guys. Other similar guys like C.J. Goodwin and Deji Olatoye that are taller guys probably aren't best suited for that either. So I do think if you can get a smaller slot, quick guy that can sort of be potentially, bring the camp and compete for a backup spot and potentially win that backup spot where he can sort of specialize in covering the Amendolas of the world, then I think that's valuable to you. But other than that, I don't think there's really much of a need there at quarterback. Mark Hill Jefferson asks, thoughts on Juan Price out of Pitt compares to Ravens Doomerville a bit? Question mark. Yes, he does.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's the best comparison for him. Like a destitute man's version of it, but yeah, basically same guy.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, they're like, Doomerville's 5'11", I think 260 coming out, very productive at Louisville. I think he led the nation in sacks that year he came out, if I'm not mistaken. And Price is, I think he barely measured at 6 feet at the Senior Bowl. I think it's like 245, 250 something. We'll see what he does in the combine in terms of his jumps and his sort of 40 times and whatnot. But I think his ceiling is sort of a Doomerville type of guy. Doomerville started off his career being a very productive sack guy, but he was really pretty terrible against the run and was by and large a sort of nickel specialist early in his career. And I think that's basically what Price's ceiling is. He's probably a nickel specialist. And, I think that's valuable. It may take him a little bit longer to impact than Doomerville did, but I do think there's the potential that he could be one of the better nickel guys a couple of years down the road. Evan Birchfield's next question is, are there any opinions on Roddy White's recent comments? I'm assuming he's referring to his wanting to fight Kyle Shanahan.
I want to watch that so bad. I really do want to watch that so bad.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's great. It's a great soundbite for Roddy to have. It certainly gets the fan base fired up. When Roddy's saying that he would have jumped off sides or whatnot, I don't think you would have had that opportunity, Roddy, because you would have been on the bench. But funny stuff from Roddy White, classic Roddy stuff. So that's my opinion. Deontay at X Sneedo asks, I keep looking for how much cap space the Falcons really have. Can you guys help me out?
So Aaron's got him at what? Like
20, slightly 28, slightly under 28.
Last time I did the cap space, I have him at 37. And that's based on 170, and everything I'm hearing says it's going to be closer to 173, 174. So
I use 170 for mine.
It could be a little different. I know Aaron's probably adjusting some of the bonuses in regards to what's it called? Adjusting some of the bonuses when it comes to, or not adjusting a couple bonuses when it comes to Schrader and Alford, where I've got them adjusted because the way that I read them, they're a little different than I think the way Aaron is seeing it on like over the cap.
No, I used Von McClure's cap details, so I got it probably adjusted the same way you do. I think the discrepancy between us is I don't think you're accounting for as many guys on the roster as I am.
Well, the other thing that I can think of is it could be that I'm not fully updated for 2017. I should be soon, but I haven't even done that. That's like my next project after I've been working on my rankings for so long. So I've been going off of numbers that were pre-Super Bowl, which was the last time I did this, was right at the beginning of the playoffs. So you'll have to forgive that. But even then I was getting like 40 million for some stuff, and I'm going off of a $170 million cap, which is probably low when we think about it in the future. We're probably thinking 200 million as soon as 2019. The Falcons have more than enough money right now. I've got them right at that 37, 36, and that's adjusting for a couple things. My real question comes from what the Falcons do, and I might have a couple players that aren't on there, but I like to use minimum contracts as filler as well. So I think the Falcons have more than enough hope to get some big guys and have more than enough money to get some big guys that they want to get. So don't worry too much about the cap. It's overblown. There's ways around it. There's ways to structure a deal to where you have big cap hits in future years when you're supposed to have just stupid high caps. So that's where we're at. Like, everybody's so overblown about the cap, and the Falcons have been every year ridiculously under it starting out.
Yeah. I got 51 guys under contract for 2017. I got them at a little bit under 28. I think once they start tendering some of their RFAs and their EFAs, that's going to drop closer to 24, 25, which is going to be about the same, I think, what they started out last year. I think they started out free agency with like 24. So, like, the cap isn't going to hinder them from being able to get a couple of guys that they want. As Thomas Dimitrov said, I do expect them to sort of focus on re-signing guys and sort of getting some of the Courtney Upshaws, the Aldrick Robinsons, the Levine Toilolos of the world back on sort of, 1 year, $1 million deals, a bunch of those, I think, as opposed to going out and splurging on other teams' free agents. I think they'll pick and choose there. I think it'll be a relatively quiet free agency for them. I don't think we're going to see probably the same level of splash that we saw early on last year by going out and getting Mack and Sanu. I think you'll see the Falcons sort of pull what the Patriots and Packers do, which is sort of let that first week sort of play out and be pretty quiet there, and then sort of try to target some bargains in that second and third wave of free agency. I think for the most part, the Falcons are going to be content with spending, that 24-ish million this offseason, and then they'll be able to free up a lot of space in the summer if and when they give some extensions to guys like Matt Ryan in particular. His cap hit this year is like 24 million. You give him an extension, there's a reasonable chance that they could cut that cap hit in half, and that's 12 million. So their regular season cap space is going to be probably primarily because they're giving extensions to guys like Matt Ryan and whatnot.
Yeah.
And Trufant as well. Markel Jefferson asked, thoughts on Quinn and possibly the coach he compares best to? What will his legacy look like after everything is said and done?
I'm hoping his legacy looks like Bill Belichick's when everything's said and done. 5 Super Bowl wins, going to 7 Super Bowls. That's what I'm hoping it is. I think Aaron would agree with me there.
Still, that's the dream.
He's already gone to 1. Just got to go to 6 more and win 5. I say that sarcastically, but if they won the next 5 in a row, we would all be like, "Holy fuck, the Falcons! They finally didn't let us down."
5 Super Bowls in a row. Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not being realistic here. That to me would be like uber homer. Yeah, we can get to the Super Bowl 5 years in a row. I mean, you can, but you need a fuck ton of luck and everything to go right.
Yeah, you would basically need like all the other teams to go away and just have like the Browns be
Yeah, like
only other NFL team that you have to worry about.
yeah, like that. No, so I think long term Quinn is probably gonna closer end up being like a Shanahan, like a Mike Shanahan, where he'll win one or two Super Bowls. The team will look good, but in the end, he's gonna kind of fade away. It's just like, oh, he won a Super Bowl and he's the best coach in our team's history. He's not gonna be like, oh my God, that's the next great coach ever of all time. Would I love it if he proved me wrong? Hell yeah, because that means the Falcons are going to be good for the next 20 years. Would I love for him to be like the next Chuck Noll or the next what was the guy name? Bill Cowher, someone like that? Fuck yeah, give me the next Bill Cowher. You know, a coach that can be there for fucking ever. As long as he's not the next Gus Bradley, everybody's happy. He's already won more games than Bradley had in just 2 seasons. So, I mean, give me what he can do, and let's go from there. But yeah, he's one of the better active head coaches.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the coach he compares to, yeah, I think he emulates a lot of what Pete Carroll does. They're not the same, but they compare favorably in terms of the type of coach that they are. As far as his legacy, like I don't know. It's it's a little early after 2 years to be talking legacy questions in terms of where Quinn is going to be 2 years from now versus 12 years from now. I have no idea. I hope it's great. I hope his legacy is like a Bill Cowher, a guy that we talk about potentially as a sort of Hall of Fame sort of head coach. But I have no idea. After 1 year, Jim Moore looked like he was a great coach. So, and Dan Reeves, took the Falcons to the Super Bowl in the second year, and it didn't quite finish out. Not to say that that's going to be where Quinn's legacy is, but you never know with the future. So, you just sort of take it as it comes and hope for the best. West Country Falcon asks, what do we got to do to get new jerseys? Who even makes this decision? We can sell it to blank as a change of identity and growth following the loss and hopefully help him forget the embarrassment and enormous sense of annoyance filling the premature trip to the sideline.
Blank makes a premature trip to the sideline in the fourth quarter of every single game. So just shut up about that. Like, that wasn't anything different than what Blank does every week. The rest of it, I mean, I don't know. I would love new jerseys. I'd love to see a redesign of some sort. Maybe I'm just getting bored because there's this new stadium coming and I'm like, new. And it's like crack to me. But like, give me new jerseys, give me a slightly modified logo, and go from there because something's got to change.
Okay. I don't, this is the old man in me, but like I don't really care at this point if they get new jerseys. Like I like new jerseys to look at, but like if we change I don't intend on buying another Falcon jersey ever again. It's just I'm at a point where it's just like, what's the point? I only wear it a couple of times a year. I only wear it on the show. I'm assuming that Blank and Nike make that decision. And, I think we'll probably see a change in the jerseys probably in the next 5 years since they switched to this one in 03, 04. So it's almost been, 12 years or so.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like I expect there to be a change with that, probably by the time we get to like year 15 or something like that. I'm sure they'll decide to make a switch there. But, if it's, I like.
I mean, this year would be year 15 in these jerseys.
Is it? Okay.
So that's why, like, I get where he's coming from.
No, I get where he's coming from. Like, I'm not saying I'm like not anti changing jerseys. Like, I do. I'm that guy that gets mad when they don't wear the black pants. So like, it's something that I care about to the degree that I like looking at the team looking like badasses on the field. But as far as like in terms of my personal investment in them getting new jerseys, like at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter to me. Just, all I would ask is they wear more black pants. That's all.
That's fair.
Yeah. Okay. A question from Forever NAJ. He asks thoughts on drafting Caleb Brantley in the first and getting Zeitler/Chandler Jones in free agency.
I mean, if you can get Zeitler and Jones in free agency, that's probably your whole load on free agency right there, which I'm okay with. And then Caleb Brantley in the first, you're looking at Chandler Jones and Zeitler. Zeitler, I think, completely clears up your offensive line, and you've got the best offensive line in the league at that point. Because the weakest spot on that line to me would be Andy Levitre or even Jake Matthews, which if Jake Matthews is your worst offensive lineman, you're doing pretty fucking good. I mean, I know Aaron would agree with me. Like, a guy who ranks between 11th and 13th at his position is way better than, and that's your worst guy, means every other guy you have on your roster is near the top 10 for theirs. Like, it would be argued that Andy Levitre is a top 10 left guard. You could easily argue that Zeitler's a top 5 right guard. You could argue that Mack is a top 5 center, and you got a top 5 right tackle, if that's your line. That would be an insane offensive line. It would be the best in the league. The All-Pro team would basically be just Falcons and Cowboys at that point. Like, that's how good that line would be. So I would love that move. Chandler Jones, I don't think Jones gets out of Arizona, but if you like sub in any other one of these big name edges like Ingram or JPP, again, I'd love it. Just bring him in, work with it. You need that guy to play across from Vic Beasley who can come in and impact now, not 2 years from now. So I say, I mean, if you can get that guy, get him. And then Caleb Brantley, I think Brantley shows enough to play well today in a rotational role in at least the nickel. So you would just roll with Hageman and Jarrett and base, and like Brantley in a rotation of Claiborne and Jarrett, or like a rotation of Brantley and Claiborne inside and Jarrett in there as well. In the nickel, I mean, I think overall you'd have a much better team that way. So if you could get all three of these guys, you'd be doing very well. I think that's probably a best case scenario.
Yeah, I haven't watched Brantley this year. I'll get to him probably this week as I watch the D tackles. What I saw of him in 2015, though, I did like. And, he was one of the D tackles that I did legitimately like going into this season. It does sound like the Cardinals are prepared to tag Chandler Jones, so that probably nixes that idea. But Scott's idea of basically inserting somebody like JPP or Melvin Ingram, it doesn't sound like either of those guys are going to get tagged. So that would be the situation. Zeitler is a good guard. He is one of the best right guards in the league. There's no doubt about that. My only issue with that is I just think it's an expenditure that is unnecessary. When you're talking about giving another guy, and Zeitler's going to get paid this offseason because he's going to be one of the top guards in free agency. And you're talking about a contract similar to what we gave Alex Mack potentially. You're talking about $35, $40 million. I just don't think it makes a lot of financial sense for the Falcons to sort of invest that in a right guard when they don't necessarily need to. You have $30 million in Schrader. You have 45 in Mack. You're going to probably pay Jake Matthews next summer somewhere north of $60 million for what a quality left tackle makes. You look at the Cordy Glenn contract, that's what he makes. So, like, I just don't see the point of investing that much money in that position at guard when you don't really need to. Like, obviously, if you could get a player as good as Zeitler, great. But I think you can sort of draft a guy early in the draft, and potentially that guy can grow into a Zeitler for a less than a tenth of the price. And in the meantime, I think Garland showed enough in his spot duty. I think Schweitzer showed enough in his first training camp that he deserves an opportunity to compete for that job. And I think you can basically get a functional to good right guard, similar to what you had with Chris Chester, for a fraction of the cost that you would pay for Zeitler. And I don't know if paying $40 million for Zeitler offers all that much upside in terms of, what you could get out of some combination of Garland, Schweitzer, and someone like a Luke Jokel or somebody like that you could probably get for like a real cheap contract. So that's my opinion on that in terms of getting Zeitler. Again, as I've said multiple times, if the Falcons do wind up going in that direction, I'm not going to complain about it. But I just think it's a lot of money to be investing in your offensive line on top of, the $120 million that you're going to give Matt Ryan, the $70 million that you give Julio Jones, whatever you're going to give Devontae Freeman, the $30 million that you give him Sanu, the $70 million that you're going to give Trufant, the $100 million that you're going to give Big Beasley 2 years from now. It's just a lot of money to pay for. You got to make some cuts at some point in time. You just can't have this super top heavy roster with all these expensive veterans. And I think right guard is one of those spots that you can afford to make that cut. Okay, so that's our show, guys. We appreciate all the questions. We know it was another long one, but you guys send in all your great questions, so we got to answer them. And if you want to get your questions submitted on next week's show, we will talk about the offensive line and defensive line, as well as edge players on next week's show as our positional previews. And you want to send in those questions, you can use the hashtag Falcons mailbag. You can tweet at the show's Twitter handle is Falcons PFC. I'm at FalcFans. Scott is at Karasik S. Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, as well as Pro Football Central and iTunes and Stitcher and all the various podcast platforms that you can find us on. And we'll be back next week as usual, hopefully at the same time on Tuesday.